decade ago, I noticed that I would feel more comfortable avoiding to talk about religion. But then we got trapped because we had no religious literacy. So when we had government people coming to the podium and saying, but this does not work for us because our religious leader, our Sharia, our churches do not allow this, that, or the other, we were short of constructive arguments. And that's when I started discovering how much the work of scholars, of people who have religious literacy, who came and deconstructed all those notions and helped us really with a lot of research, very well done, answer those member states who always hide behind tradition, culture, and religion because they don't want to effect change. And often they say it's not us, it's them, and we can't impose this change and we can't impose this law. So we started to interact with them much more constructively by giving them best practices and how it has been done elsewhere and how can this be done in line with faith and not have a divorce. We worked a lot with the Young Women Christian Association, who were fantastic also women leaders that we usually met regularly with when we were meeting in person in Geneva and having a lot of discussion about reconciling faith and rights. We have worked also, discovered a fantastic group called Musawa that does a lot of work and research on Islam and so-called interpretation of Sharia that gave us many arguments, a lot of comparative tables. So it was really very substantive. The interaction was extremely useful for us in bringing these issues to the forefront with member states and getting also a positive feedback from member states. Now, coming to all of this and linking it to the COVID-19 pandemic, which we all noticed, we had, unfortunately, a lot of setback happens in emergencies in general, and pandemics are a form of emergency, and they usually affect the same groups, those that are in a sort of the shade, they are not visible. So women and girls got pretty much more affected than men, although the pandemic in theory touched everyone. Women who were 70% of the health force were still the one caring at home, were still the one very much exposed and were still suffering and suffering even more from violence because they could not report it. But we were also very glad to see how much faith actors were also on the same wavelength. And we had almost a year ago now, I think, Ibrahim, a fantastic webinar with Religion for Peace with, I don't know, maybe 200 participants at the time. It was on the, how to confront COVID-19 from the prism of faith, gender, and human rights. And I think it was one of the first webinar in the series of peer-to-peer learning. So this is really a ball rolling, and we are gaining momentum with that by the minute. I would have given you some illustration, but maybe I'll leave them for the discussion on how these have brought concrete results in situation of countries when we were able to engage faith-based actors in discussing the gender equality dimension and in bringing also Faith for Right itself as an initiative, its 18 commitment to the debate with member states. I think I'll stop here. I hope I did not take the full 8 minutes because I would like to come back within the discussion with some illustration and especially answer questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nahla, not only for being on time, but really for bringing us into the heart of the discussion. I'm struck by three telegraphic things that you said, although I know you very much and I know your thinking. The first idea that I take from what you said is that misperceptions exist even within the experts communities, let us face it. So let alone the general public, and even let alone the manipulators who deliberately create and fabricate the misperception. So that's a very fundamental notion to bear in mind when we discuss the issue of religious and form literacy. Secondly, the human rights mechanisms can really inject this new requirements. I think it's a prerequirement for ensuring respect for human rights. You cannot ensure respect for something that you do not know well enough. But these two notions give me the good transition to Ahmed Shahid. Presenting Ahmed Shahid is very easy because he needs none. However, I would say that he is Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Religion since 2016. He is a career diplomat, twice foreign minister of the Maldives, and he was the rapporteur of the Faithful Rights Framework, along with Nahla and many other experts from the specialized civil society. Ahmed, we are really eager to hear you on this topic because it was you who initially coined the notion of religious literacy and freedom of religion or belief literacy in your recent United Nations report to the Human Rights Council and General Assembly. So in your view, what is the difference between them? Why are we missing them? And how can, in practice, from your own field experience, how can they contribute to enhance gender equality? Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Good afternoon all, and thank you OHCHR, especially Ibrahim and Michael, for organizing and inviting me to join this panel. And of course, really pleased to be here on the panel with Nahla and others. Well, I don't know if I am the person who coined these two phrases, Ibrahim, but I certainly use them quite profusely because they're so important to create the space to ensure that everybody can enjoy the human rights, including those who want to operate within the paradigms of their religious beliefs. So what I mean by FOB literacy or literacy in freedom of belief is knowing the normative contours of that right with clarity so that we avoid the misconceptions that are abound, that surround it, either through erroneous interpretations or just deliberate distortion of the normative framework. Some of the, of course, this can have quite significant implications for gender equality rights because, quite often people argue that religious freedom or FOB protects religions and beliefs rather than the individual's right to hold those beliefs. That's an important distinction because the framework doesn't protect beliefs and ideas or religions because it only protects individuals' right to hold on to ideas so long as the expression does not, their manifestation doesn't harm the rights of other people. So one element of the misconception that FOB protects religions are things like blasphemy laws or suppression of dissent, or even the argument that whatever is justified, whatever is taught in religions can be applied in practice. So women's rights often get sacrificed the altar of religious beliefs through patriarchal readings or whichever. So knowing that, pointing out that what we are protecting are the rights of individuals to hold these beliefs rather than beliefs per se is an important point, as well as the important point that built into this right is a claim for equality, that men and women have an equal right to all the freedoms enshrined in Article 18 and other interlinked rights. So there can be no distinction between, man, woman, girl, or child in terms, girl or boy in terms of rights they're entitled, or even based upon others, gender constructions, gender characteristics. And that liberating understanding opens the pathway for enjoying the protections and for states offering those protections to everybody. In terms of the most frequent types of errors made in this area is a limitations regime, in terms of where states try to impose limitations that are either too broad or sometimes they don't impose any limitations either. But states have a requirement to ensure they protect the rights of others from harm caused by one's manifestation of religious belief. At the same time, state must ensure their restrictions are the least restrictive ones and which meet the tests of legality, legitimacy, necessity, and proportionality, and of course, non-discrimination as well. So knowing this complex framework is important, also because in recent times we've seen arguments which seem to claim that FOB or religious freedom is a prior right, has a degree of other rights, which is not correct. It's part of the human rights framework. It has to be understood in a holistic framework. So claims for equality, claims for all other rights have to be seen in line with this framework. And this has implications also of what Nahla was talking about, religious literacy. If freedom of belief doesn't protect ideas and beliefs per se, then they're open for contestation. That means we are in the space of interpretation, debate, dissent, and of course, looking at how each of us can articulate the views we want, and of course, even contribute to the debates within religion and open the space for such literacy. I don't want to go into the area of Nahla's, articulation is very, very articulate there in terms of religious literacy, but that's a very important area, making sure that we use arguments that are framed within religious discourses that enable individuals to argue from within the tradition, ensure they can push for those rights from that tradition, rather than saying you have to leave the tradition to be able to claim human rights. But to get there, we have to first of all recognize that the normative contours of this human right permits individuals to challenge these beliefs, to contribute to their beliefs and have their own interpretations without coercing others or being coerced by others, to enable them to live a life that enables them to, self-develop and enjoy their human rights to the full. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, so thank you very much, Ahmed. I think we're keeping very well on time, I would say, in fact. We're now going to be able to pass over to our two panelists to discuss a little bit more about what Nahla and Ahmed have described, and also give insights from their experiences. We were waiting for Bafana, who I see is not on the call yet. So in the meantime, I will be happy to pass over to Nora Khalaf-Elij, who is presenting from her place as fellow at Goldsmiths University in London, where she is a gender and development practitioner and specialist in the Faith and Civil Societies unit, specializing in the intersection of religion and gender with international development policy and practice. Oh, apologies that my camera is switched off. I will just switch that back on. Nora has been working in this area for a number of years, and I will, without further ado, hand over to her. Nora, you have about 10 minutes to present.
Great. Thank you so much, Olivia. Thank you so much to Ibrahim as well, and thank you to Nahla and Ahmed for your great contributions. It's a privilege to be a part of this conversation. I couldn't agree more with Nahla about what you said about the religious reservations towards SEDA, and this is a problem that we see everywhere, also outside of SEDA, just this tendency of religious arguments being used to attack women's rights, to roll back gender equality. Conservative parties in high and in low-income countries alike have embraced these arguments to justify such legislations. I want to add to this conversation just by zooming in on what it looks like in the realm of development institutions and what they are doing. And I want to highlight 3 areas here. So I want to highlight partnerships, religious literacy, and the gender dimension. I just wanted to, first of all, just agree that even if we, work on partnerships, work on religious literacy, work on gender equality, if we don't wholeheartedly accept SEDA in, high and low-income countries alike, then all of this does not really help. So these were some excellent points. Thank you so much. All right, so by now, we know that development has always partnered with institutions and is increasingly acknowledging that religious partners are a really important part of this. And over the past few years, the past few decades, this has been happening more and more. But when it comes to partnerships, what's really important is to understand, quote unquote, that what it means to find the quote unquote right partner. And this means that you have to acknowledge that when you partner with any organization, you are emboldening their ideology, including their gender ideology. You are legitimizing them. You are improving their access to resources. And so this means that that any partner that development selects needs to have a solid track record on gender equality, and we should not just scrutinize partners from a faith background, but also from a secular background. And we need to make sure that partners at the forefront of achieving gender equality, whether they're faith actors or not. And this by itself brings about several challenges, because sometimes gender, let's say, let's call them gender progressive or feminist organizations, are actually hesitant to engage with foreign secular organizations because they are afraid of being branded Western agents. And that would delegitimize them in the eyes of the very local religious authority that they seek to challenge. But I think regardless of this, development organizations should still always continue to identify women's rights organizations and attempt to partner with them, because at the very least, they can learn from these organizations who have decades of experience in the context and have worked with religious contexts and understand how religion interacts with gender in these specific contexts. And the other challenge that comes with that is that Western development agencies are not automatically feminist. And they actually have a track record of forming strategic partnerships over feminist partnerships. And this is not something that is automatically evil. It's just that development tries to be efficient, get things done. And so oftentimes, you just try and find the one partnership that opens the door. And that's the one that has the most resource, that is the most dominant, that has the most networks. And those partners happen to be mostly male. They happen to be the most powerful in the community, and they are mostly run by male leaders of the community. And in the long run, this can be very counterproductive. So let's move on to the second part that I wanted to talk about, which is religious literacy. Religious literacy has entered the development discourse a while ago and is still a bit misunderstood. And it's a new discourse, but there are 4 areas that I want to talk about. Actually, let's make it 3. I'm going to try and be a bit concise here. And it's really about, it's not about understanding every religion. It's not a theological discourse. It's really about understanding that religious discourses are diverse. They're not static. They change through a history. They are internally diverse. Different people interpret religions differently. And there's a difference between culture and tradition. And very importantly, patriarchy. And that brings me to the second point, which is that religion interacts with power. And so a big part of religious literacy is to understand how religion and power intersect, and how religion and patriarchy intersect, because patriarchy is the biggest system of power. And this would actually by itself help us understand gender and religion. For example, practices like FGM or child marriage. So if we had religious literacy, we would understand that FGM is not a religious practice. We would no longer make these generalizations. We would be able to challenge those and to support those groups that do challenge those, because there are many groups that do. And then the final point that I want to highlight about religious literacy is that it has to begin by challenging the fear that exists around the topic of religion. So on paper, everyone is like, yes, let's talk about religion. Let's talk about faith. Religion matters. But in reality, people are very hesitant to talk about this. And so this means that in practice, not much is getting done. Not much is being challenged. There's not much bold progress. And this is very counterproductive too. And at the end of the day, it steps in the back those people who really fight hard to challenge patriarchal misuses of religion. All right, I'm not sure. I think I might be running low on time. But Olivia, could you just give me a heads up?
Yes, you could just have one minute.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Just to round up then, a final point is just the gender analysis. So every development institution in the world is mandated to have a solid gender program, and yet that in practice does not often happen as well as it's supposed to be. If it was implemented as well as it was discussed in the Beijing conference, for example, then we would, by nature, already have a much better understanding of gender and religion, because we would just have this really thorough gender analysis that would look at all the social influences of gender, and that would include the interplay of gender and religion. So that's another ingredient that is missing, a good solid gender analysis. I'll leave it at this. So good solid partnerships that are based on a good gender track record, regardless of whether you're a faith-based actor or a secular actor, a solid religious literacy skill, and then a good gender analysis. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nora. Yes, I think those are the absolute points that if we had all of those working together, integrated together, we'd build a lot better partnerships for FORB and gender equality. So now I'm very happy to pass to Diki Sofyan, who is at the graduate school in the Universitas Gadjah Mada in Indonesia. Diki will be speaking a little bit more about religious literacy work that's been done in Indonesia. Diki, over to you.
Right, thank you very much, Olivia. And I'm really happy to be here, and it's always a pleasure to be engaging with the stakeholders of FORB. And I'm particularly happy to see Mr. Ibrahim Salama again. I think the last time we met was on the workshop on human dignity and religions in the EU in Brussels. And of course, Dr. Ahmad Shahid, we just held a joint webinar with the EU Embassy in Jakarta recently. And I think we'll be continuing on with our conversations on Resolution 1618 with the EU Embassy, probably in the next couple of months, and also on issues of religious blasphemy and all. So I'm speaking here today based on my sort of observation, research, and engagement on FORB, religious literacy, gender, and various interfaith initiatives across Indonesia and the world. I've also been involved in many of the programs and activities done by the Indonesian Ministries of Religious Affairs and Foreign Affairs, both of which have relatively strong proclivity toward deeper sort of interfaith engagement among faith communities here in Indonesia. Now, on freedom of religion or belief, I would just like to say that there are discrepant views in terms of how the state and society perceive the issue. I think for the most part, for state officials and high-ranking government officials, to them, the issue of FORB seems to be a done deal, with the application of the Pancasila state ideology and our national motto and principle of Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, or unity in diversity, and also our constitution, which recognizes religious diversity and FORB. Both Articles 28 and 29 of our constitution guarantee human rights and the religious freedom or belief. Although I must say that there are sort of variations that exist in the interpretations and the spirit of the law. But aside from that, we have a law on human rights and already ratified the ICCPR not long after the reform period in 1998. And of course, there are problems still associated with the management of religious diversity and minority groups. But I'm constantly sort of very careful in the use of the word minority. In Indonesia, I have some reservations because there are conceptual and legal problems associated with it when we apply it in Indonesia. So thus I prefer to use the term minoritization in the sort of active voice to sort of mean that there are, politics and politicking going on when it comes to the minoritization of certain religious groups in society. And as I think some of you well know, that we still have the law on blasphemy, and some of the laws in our country still sort of assume the idea of minoritization and the practice of minoritization, and there are also lower levels of regulations and bylaws like the building of houses of worship, and in certain bylaws in certain provinces and mayoralties and districts, remain problematic until today. Although I must also say that there are many efforts being made by some committed parliamentarians, academics, NGOs, CSOs, and also very significant and influential religious groups that are proactively promoting FORB and to reverse this whole process of minoritization. We have a network of South Asian and Southeast Asian FORB. I've attended both of their meetings in Sri Lanka and in Colombo, and also in Bangkok in Thailand, and in Indonesia. We have a network of FORB activists comprising individuals and groups, from various religious affiliations. And I also recently consulted for IPP FORB and APHR in doing a mapping of legislations on FORB in the 11 countries of Southeast Asia, so ASEAN plus Timor-Leste. So we have pretty much worked on what we call dialogue in action. Yeah? So we don't take interfaith activity as being religious leaders going on stage to have a media blitz and interviews with the media and so on. Yeah? But we try to apply this principle of dialogue in action by way of infusing religious understandings and interfaith interactions on issues of environmental awareness, on ecological conservation, women's issues, access to justice, anti-corruption, and so on and so forth. We have just worked together with the Agency for the Restoration of Peatland in Indonesia, for instance. And I'm currently working with the Islamic Studies Center in Jakarta through the Templeton Foundation grant to work on sort of Islam and ecological conservation in our pesantrens or Islamic boarding schools. Yeah? So there are many initiatives as such. And what we have done in the past 3 to 4 years is to work on the religious literacy. And I just sent all of you my recent article on that, which was really based on our work with the Ministry of Religious Affairs, where we had trained more than 1,000 religious extension officers and also researchers and trainers of religion from within the Ministry of Religious Affairs to work on issues about religion and the state, about religion and the environment, about religion and human dignity, and religion and the internet. This whole idea about cyber religion is big here in Indonesia. So we define religious literacy as not teaching or learning religion, but it is really teaching and learning about religion. So the idea that there is religious diversity out there and the complexity in the management thereof is one of the sort of underlying assumption of our religious literacy. I also personally and wholeheartedly believe that religious diversity is not just a social fact, not just a reality, but it is also part of the Sunnatullah, part of the divine plan and will. And so these are just some of the sort of principles that we have worked with the Ministry of Religious Affairs. I mean, for your information, we have more than 100,000 religious extension officers put at the sub-district level in all of the provinces and districts throughout Indonesia. With the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we have also been working quite closely with a number of ulama, diplomats, parliamentarians, and activists. I gave training to the officials from the Ministry of Culture, for instance, in southern Vietnam, and also in Pakistan with the EU embassy in Islamabad. And also I trained senior diplomats from Afghanistan on Pancasila, on religious diversity, and most recently with Uzbek politicians and parliamentarians. In the G20 Interfaith Forum, I also presented the program on religious literacy. And I can see that the G20 is also becoming quite influential, and increasingly they are also putting up religious literacy as one of their sort of main themes. And this year, the G20 is led by Italy. And as of the 1st of December this year, Indonesia will take over the G20 leadership. So I think there is a lot of opportunity for us to work for that. But we are also currently working towards a program with the Presidential Office and the Ministry of Religious Affairs and Ministry of Foreign Affairs to work on the Resolution 1618 and basically trying to sort of implement and share our experiences in fighting against stigmatization, hate speech, and so on and so forth. So that is in the pipeline, and we hope to sort of do that sometime in late 2021 or early 2022. So I'll be more than happy if the Office of the High Commissioner would also be involved in that process as well. Now, just my last comment on gender and women leadership is that in our religious literacy program, we always take into account not only the participation of women leaders in religion, but also as trainers and also as authors of our modules. As mentioned, we have a whole module for the extension officers on religion and the state, religion and the internet, religion and ecology, and religion and human dignity. So we have worked quite closely with women's groups as well and youth groups as well to sort of take into account their perspectives and views on religion and how we can coexist together peacefully and harmony. So thank you very much for your attention. I'll be happy to answer some of your comments and questions.
Thank you very much, Dickie. A wonderful example of all the work that you've been doing, and I hope people have been able to download the document, the article that Dickie dropped in the chat just a few minutes ago. So now we'll be handing over to a question and answer session. Please put your questions in the chat for any of the speakers that we've heard so far. Ibrahim, I will hand over to you for the question and answers.
Thank you very much, Olivia. That was already an excellent part and very rich panoply of presentations. But I think the best part is starting now, even because it's reacting and comparing notes on what we all have heard. So I will simultaneously look at the chat box, but I had also in the chat box some requests for questions. So let me start by you, Michael. You had a question about some of the presentations. Go ahead, 2 to 3 minutes maximum, please.
Many thanks. And just to briefly respond precisely to Dickie's and Nora's points, thanks a lot for your reference to the various also existing fora like G20 Interfaith Forum, like the Istanbul process on Resolution 1618. And there obviously from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, we would be more than happy to collaborate. And also just to flag that in the 2 G20 interfaith recommendations in Buenos Aires and in Osaka, there was a specific reference to the Beirut Declaration. And I'm just reading that the G20 countries should support UN-based initiative to reduce incitement to hatred by supporting religious leaders and faith-based actors in fulfilling their human rights responsibilities as summarized in the Beirut Declaration. So I think that's a very concrete example of where the various actors and fora can really join forces very cleverly. And then a question to Nora, and thanks a lot for your very, really elucidating presentation. And I wanted to ask you a precise question, how to best find human rights abiding partnerships. You mentioned rightly, for secular and faith actors, it's really vital not to empower, to embolden, to finance the wrong partners. But how can also the United Nations, do you have any guidance for us of the do's and don'ts? Who should we engage with, and what should we be looking for? So any guidance, any guidelines for also the United Nations in engaging with religious actors would be much appreciated. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Michael. Are there any other questions before? I hope all speakers will note the questions, because even if it's not addressed to them, their input into the same question would still be enriching. So any other questions from the room, virtual room? If not, and pending other questions coming to me by raise of hand or by the chat box. Of course, I have the same question to Nora as you expect, Mike, because this is our daily suffering at the United Nations. But I would simply add, not as a joke, if I take your example, Nora, and we say that the gender equality record of the face actors, potential partners, should be a prerequisite, we will find eligible. And it's just to show that it's difficult. Who should do this? I mean, in addition to what are the criteria, who has the legitimacy, and what is the methodology to abide by this? And I would forward the same question, particularly to Ahmed Shahid and Nahla Haider, because since the adoption 2-3 years ago of the Beirut Declaration, they have been engaged in many different ways. Nahla, within the examples that she mentioned, and the attempts of CEDAW to establish a knowledge hub that tries to demystify and refute the political manipulation of religion through state reviews. But any feedback from you, what is it that you learned now, Nahla and Ahmed, since Beirut, that if you had known it then, you would have added something about the same question that Nora had raised? Second question, essentially to Nora, but also to everybody. You mentioned a very real and dynamic and strategic notion that is almost unnoticed. The dynamic nature of the religious narratives. They keep changing. Now, who observes this? How can we analyze this? I mean, without mentioning any particular example, we recently found a very high level interreligious initiatives of many kinds. Now, where is this debated? Is there a room here for, is there a thread that somebody should be picking, and who and how and to do what? I'm saying this because I started to list in the Faithful Rights 18 commitments how many specific commitments deal with the issue of the narrative and the interpretation. And they're commitment 1, commitment 3, commitment 4, commitment 8, 9, and 12. I will abstain from raising them, not to consume time, but all of these are related to the interpretation and to the dynamic nature. Dickie, great to see you after the last time we met in our earlier life, the normal life before COVID in Brussels, as you said. But I'm really struck, first of all, as Michael said, we'll be very happy to consider partnering, because what you said raises a fundamental difficult issue of the relationship between the regional and the international levels of engagement, and of course the national one. So from your large experience, and I've been following with admiration your work, what is the right sequence, and how can one avoid the current state of affairs, which some might see as an abundance of dialogues for very various reasons, with very meager outcome at the end? What is it that we should do differently or stop doing in terms of these engagements in order to optimize these levels of engagements? So those are the questions that were inspired to me. Of course, to Ahmed, the fundamental question you spoke about, a very strategic idea, which is arguing from within rather than imposing from above. How would you qualify or cluster the existing attempts from your perspective and your activities? Is most of the initiatives rather changing from within and exchanging on equal footing, or is it rather still the top-down usual way of doing things? This applies not only to the United Nations agencies engagement, but even to individual states, who at times also take the religious actor and factor as a vehicle for their own interests, even if they were legitimate, but not necessarily as a tool to change from within. Also, Ahmed, is changing from within implying an implicit danger of condoning wrong practices? Same question to Nahla as well. If we say change from within, and you mentioned the admirable example of Musawat, can states apply the Musawat approach, or is the Musawat approach containing a central danger of condoning something? We are used in the Human Rights Committee to apply the right and wrong, the violation or the compatibility. That's the same approach of special rapporteurs and treaty bodies. But the notion of engagement, does it contain a risk, a slippery slope, and how to avoid it from your own experience? So that's for the complementary questions. Any more questions? Because if I see no hands or no requests for the floor in the chat box, I will then refer back in the probably reversed order. I will stand with Nora, then Dicky, then Nahla and Ahmed. Nora, can I ask you to respond?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for these questions. They're very big questions, but they're extremely important. So I'll try and do my best answering them. The first question was about what could be the guidelines to find partners who abide by human rights standards, women's rights. The very fact that we're discussing that means, of course, that there aren't such guidelines right now, which is part of the problem, that we don't know, who should do this, how do we do this. That's part of the problem. And I think in the meantime, the best thing to do, or at least what I came to the conclusion to do, is when I was doing my research and I spoke to women's rights activists in 9 different countries, was to the consensus was to say to look at the collective track record of organizations, to really say, does this organization have, let's say, like 10 years of commitment to these principles, but in the long run, yeah, there has to be sort of a firm guideline on what do we see as our shared principle. But then at the end of the day, also, I think the question was who should be doing this, and that brings us back to what I think is recruitment, because we don't prioritize gender early enough. Human rights and gender and women's rights early enough in the project cycle. And I see this especially with gender priorities and women's rights, because that happens really late. It happens when we put in some gender language in reports, or talk about some gender outcomes, or we hire some more women on local teams, but it doesn't happen often enough before. So what I mean, for example, some people suggested when we hire people in, let's say, in the UN headquarters in Rome, already a criteria should be, does this person, even if this person isn't hired for a gender department, does this person have any commitment to gender? So that then later you don't have such a hard time mainstreaming gender and convincing people that this matters, because your entire body of staff already is on board. This is the problem, right? That you constantly have to convince people that these things matter, because it happens too late in the process, that we bring in these principles too late. So I think that's a big problem, that we just started too late. And then the other question on the dynamics of religion and who's supposed to observe this. Ibrahim, I think you touched the very problem of religious literacy. And in the academic world, this is what is debated right now. Who should be doing religious literacy? Should it be the secular people, or should it be the religious people? And who defines these groups, and who does it? Who owns religious literacy? And there's no right answer here. And at the end of the day, it's, as I said before, it's not so much about being a theologist and being able to map out the entire landscape of one religion and being able to understand how it evolved throughout history in every single context. It's not about that, as it is about just recognizing at least that whatever you learned about a religion is very context specific about that place. So if I go to one region of Tunisia and I learn something about one Islamic practice, then I have to know that might not even be, something that people do in the country next door, even if they have the same religion there. This might be something really specific about that one region in Tunisia. And so just having this understanding that it's about context is already much further than a lot of people go right now. So rather than just understanding everything, just acknowledging that. I'll leave it at that. And
thank you, Nora, for very useful thoughts, and also for emphasizing how far important the right questions are than the best answers, who are not always there. But Nora's answers, Dicky, adds a question to you, which is how, in your practice, you distinguish religious literacy from literacy about religions, because the common perception would be the opposite of what you opted for, which I'm all of your view. But how does this distinction is feasible in practice, particularly as a huge laboratory, the biggest laboratory of religious diversity in the world, which is your beautiful country? Dicky, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Ibrahim, for the comments and question, and also Michael and the rest. I think I'll just say one thing, that during the G20 Interfaith Forum in Osaka, which I attended, I think there were like 1,500 people who attended that event. There were some reservations and resistance against religious literacy. I think one of the reasons is that, the religious literacy is a rather sort of counterintuitive solution. People think like, with all the religious terrorism, populism, and extremism, why do you need to add more, teachings and learning about religion, right? But religious literacy, as I mentioned, is not about teaching and learning religion, but it's really about, understanding the diversity, understanding about the complexity of the phenomenon we call religion, and how people practice that in numerous different ways and means, right? So just acknowledging and appreciating and celebrating that fact alone is not a message that is easily brought to committed faith communities. So they need to open up to other sort of worldviews and theologies. And the way we think about religious literacy is in terms of, as I mentioned, dialogue in action. So we work together in functional groups, in collaborating for certain objectives. And I think if you look at the Rainforest Initiative, for instance, that was launched in Jakarta, perhaps 2 years ago, 1.5 years ago. I mean, that is one of the best examples of dialogue in action, where you have different faith communities working to conserve the rainforest. Of course, Indonesia is one of the largest rainforests in the world, together with Brazil and Africa, in some parts of Africa. And so that is one obvious sort of way and mean to sort of implement what we call religious literacy. And I think it goes a long way in terms of getting people to work together. And I mentioned the religious extension officers. I mean, they are spread throughout the country and in all provinces, in all districts, but yet most of these religious extension officers do not know each other. So the Muslim religious extension officers do not know their Catholic, Christian, Hindu, Protestant, Confucian counterparts, even within their own sub-districts. So our religious literacy program essentially sort of broke those silos and force them to work together and collaborate and to think about the real challenges that they are facing. Because one of the underlying assumptions that we have about religious literacy is that all of the faith communities are more or less facing the same kind of problems, issues, and challenges of the day. I mean, you think about the issue of human dignity. I think all of the faith communities are still struggling in terms of how they could redefine and recontextualize human dignity. And I've had some harsh conversations, even with our European friends, you know, they think that human dignity is in contradiction to human rights, for instance. I mean, I disagree with that. I think there is a lot of, room overlaps. You know, in fact, if you look at the human rights laws and conventions, I mean, all of them is essentially about human dignity, but yet there seems to be a lot of reservations and resistance. And I understand the logic and the argument about this, because I think there's fear that the duty bearers will be left, with not being accountable for what they do or what they don't do. And so I understand that argument, but I think we need to sort of bring the conversation forward in terms of trying to get religious communities to work together, and especially bringing as well women leaders in religion into the fore, into the sort of stage, and give them a place at the table to sort of bring out some of the issues that are being faced by faith communities from the gender perspective, from the women's perspective. I think even during this pandemic, we are seeing a lot of increase in a lot of domestic violence against women, against children, for instance. I think this is happening quite rampantly around the world. So I think faith communities need to also address some of these issues. I mean, why is this happening despite the fact that faith communities, of course, put family values as one of the main and core teachings of their religions. I think coming to your question about narratives, I think we are doing counter narratives every day on a daily basis. I mean, if you look at the hate speeches and the things that extremist and radicalist groups are churning out in social media, in the internet, we have a saying in Indonesia that the intolerant groups and the extremists and radicalist groups are working full-time while we are working only part-time. The people who are involved in these interfaith initiatives and engagement, we are not working as radically as the radical religious people. So I think we need to step up the plate and work harder, and I think join forces so that we can make a deeper influence. Now, your question on the national, regional, and international, I think what's most important is to always look at the policies and legal frameworks of the states and member countries. As I saw in the mapping of the legislations throughout the Southeast Asian nations, we are still confronting a lot of problems and issues and challenges with respect to even some of the constitutions are quite problematic, let alone the laws, for instance, relating to race, religion, or blasphemy, and building of houses of worships and so on and so forth. So I think we need to focus not just on the sort of societal level, but really looking at the laws and legislations, regulation, even to the level of the bylaws at the district and provincial levels or state levels in some of the federal countries that we have in Southeast Asia. But I must say that I am fairly appalled by Indonesia's recent no vote in the R2P. And I just had a discussion with one of the staff of the presidential office just yesterday on this. And obviously the government has some reservations with respect to why this is being considered for an annual agenda as opposed to a reporting-based agenda within the General Assembly. So I look forward to working with you all on the resolution 1618 to be held in Indonesia, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Dicky, for all the enlightening answers. But thank you also because the more answers you provide, the more questions you and Nora have raised. So let me just quickly, before going back to other requests for the floor, capture two questions from Nora's intervention. Contextualization, even of the religious narrative, is a very fundamental evolutionary, if not revolutionary, requirement for religions to play their role. Now, the question, and I'm adding this, most difficult question to the list for Nahla and Ahmed at the very end. Contextualization is part, it's module 0 of the toolkit on faithful rights. It's that you take these principles and you contextualize them. How much in practice could this be a risk to the universality of human rights? Or can it be misused, this contextualization, from your own experience? The second question coming from your answers, Diki, is particularly your description of the religious literacy as opposed to teaching religions as such, which happens every day, unfortunately not always the right ways with the right results. Do we have a curricula for this? Can there be a curricula for this or not? How can we, what are the national experiences? Where can one find them? We find a lot about interfaith dialogues, but religious literacy as such, are there features, emerging features or not? I also have a question from Hendel Sayer, which is in the chat box. You can see it. It's a very interesting reflection. You would forgive me, Hind, a little bit for a slight reformulation, being faithful to the trust of what you said. I'm transforming it into the following question. Is conditionality a good incentive for faith actors, or is it a bad imposition? Is requiring their adherence to the gender equality agenda in whichever format, let it be the CEDAW provisions, let it be any other related declarations of the United Nations, is it something good that encourages them, or is it counterproductive? Is it compatible or in violation of the peer-to-peer learning? So it's a very difficult question again, but I'm sure Nahla and Ahmed's experience have reflections on this. I had a question in the chat book from Shukriyan Ali, but I saw his hand, so I prefer that he asks his question directly. Shukriyan, you have the floor. Are you there? Well, while Shukriyan is finding the buttons to click, I think his question about the role of technology in light of that's in the interchange box. Again, I'm slightly tweaking his remark about the importance of using technology and how can we do that better in light of the abundance of webinars and online engagements, whether by treaty bodies who complain all the time from this for very good reasons, or the special rapporteurs who have less problems with the digital world. But Shukriyan, enough for me to reformulate your thoughts. Please take the floor. I see your yellow hand, but I don't see you coming. Did I distort your comment in the chat box? Too much or just a little? Okay, so I will come back to Shukriyan once he can take the floor. But then with this, I will move probably in the same order to first you, Ahmed, and then Nahla.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Brian. It's been very interesting, thought-provoking contributions. Thank you all for that. There have been a lot of questions and responses that have gone. I think in terms of religious literacy, I think it would be, of course, it is fundamentally a sociological perspective, looking at the diversity of ways of interpreting, practicing, behaving religion. I suppose that contributes to the idea that there are more ways than one of relating to one's I think beliefs. But it's also more than just a sociological perspective. There must necessarily also be some doctrinal theological understandings of the range of diverse perspectives that are held or can be formulated within the tradition, but also beyond that into pedagogy as well. So we need to look at both sociological perspectives, theological perspectives, and pedagogical ones as well. Because in terms of, as Nora was saying, one doesn't really need to know too much about theology to be able to highlight that the ways things are in different contexts varies, that very often religion itself is manifested contextually. Therefore, that contextual understanding is so important. And there have been initiatives in the past whereby people have mapped how different sort of, people did things of a similar sort, I suppose, in Indonesia, as opposed to what done in Tunisia and Morocco and elsewhere, comparing how these different ways of relating to perhaps a common tradition provided for diversity within that tradition. So in other words, the point being demonstrating the fact of diversity as a way to perhaps engage more with diversity. And that's quite a sociological perspective. But also we're seeing a rise in, I think, theology-based or doctrine-based arguments that refute the more, I suppose, puritanical versions that are restrictive. And that is also an important discussion, important, I think, debate. Without that being the background, the delegitimating impact of being declared beyond the bounds of accepted doctrine is a problem. For many people, the option is either leaving what they regard to be a tradition and then embracing a secular normative framework, or staying in a tradition and being subject to all sorts of disabilities and and challenges. We have to break that either or binary and of our multiple ways of being. And of course, we're seeing in all religious traditions that nothing is an actual given as such. It's all interpretation, it's all contextual, historical, they keep changing. So while the sociological perspective can legitimate that evolving character of these doctrines, there should also be attempt to really harness the ways in which you can yourself pursue these different ways of being. And as pedagogy, I think what we're talking about essentially is creating a citizenship that, to quote you back, Ibrahim, is self-reflective and able to think critically. Without the critical thinking ability, without being self-reflective, we would not only we can't not only not deal with these issues, but we can't deal with issues of good citizenship. Whether it is religion or populism, whatever else, we fall prey to those kinds of ideas without the ability to really engage in that. So at a school level, at the children's level, again, this is about pedagogy. The Faith for Rights curriculum, the toolkit, highlight many of these pedagogical aspects of how to do it better. And then, of course, around the world, examples of how to go to the classroom context, not so much teacher-student learning, but different ways of knowing the other, peer-to-peer learning, as you have called them. So that is my first aspect. In terms of the danger of contextualizing as a threat to universalizing, I don't think that's always the case. Of course, if you relativize everything, you'll get to a point where universality is lost. But mind you, universal rights are experienced by individuals in contexts, in time, in space, and everything. And if we are blind to those time, space, aspects of this, we wouldn't really fully capture universality. So it's not really an either or again, although of course there is an absolute minimum beyond which you cannot relativize, you cannot contextualize. But the context is important to give a thicker understanding of how that right experienced in that community. You cannot be divorced from that community to enjoy your universal human rights. It has to be done within that community, and that's so important. And that is again a methodological issue. That is us from Geneva, Ibrahim, you, me, and Michael here, I would say, and perhaps Nahla, we probably fall into the sin of preaching from Geneva, when actually we should be doing more of listening to people on the grassroots and learning from them and how, from their perspectives, we could perhaps find a way to understand their situation better, and we could perhaps contribute to them making the journey themselves into a place of comfort for them to enjoy these rights. Again, I think your curriculum, Faith for Rights, does that. It's about listening to people and building from their perspectives to the universal, from the local to the universal. I think that's important. And of course, finally, the question of, I forget who raised it, the question of should we draw a line? Should we have a bar, a threshold at which groups come in? I think yes. I think that's so important that should there be state funding, should there be state support, should there be some sort of duty bearer support, then there must be minimum requirements that such organizations really should subscribe to. And of course, you can of course have broad guidelines here, and there are some examples here. We have humanitarian charter. Again, of course, there are a number of factors operating in the space. They have different areas of interest, and of course, ways of they're configured. But something common to all is a common commitment to humanitarian well-being. So likewise, there can be a standard that upholds everyone's equal rights and equal claims to equal rights as a way of the entry point at which we would consider these groups to be legitimate partners to any work that you want to undertake. I think these are some guidelines that can be used moving forward. Thank you, Brian.
Extremely useful. I'm very glad that this is recorded, because your thoughts have been a cascade of strategic clarifications on edgy, slippery slopes. Ahmed, I love your quote, and rest assured I will not quote you, the sin of preaching from Geneva, because that makes us all very sinful. But I know exactly what you meant. That was a joke. Before I move to Nahla, I see from the comment box again another interesting reflection from Hamd Sair about the need for guidelines. It's a very important thought for all of us. the need for guidelines for contextualization and adaptation of programs and curricula, areas that can be adapted and others which are a red line. The notion of a red line, it's again another very difficult area. What is the minimum of untouchable content and what is the much larger room of evolution and dynamism? If I were to force slightly another quote on what Ahmed Shahid just said, he didn't say it this way, but that's how I understood it. Without critical thinking, religions suffocate. So if this is the case, the core principles are there, but everything, and here I'm quoting Ahmed much more faithfully, everything is a matter of interpretation beyond the core principles. So that was a thought in the comment box. Nahla, what's your take on all of the above? Please click.
Thank you all very much. And really, that is another confirmation, if there was any need, that these peer-to-peer learning is extremely, extremely important. Because, again, my personal takeaway is, again, any top-down approach that does not really intersect properly with bottom-up and where we both meet and interact, this is the peer-to-peer, and this is where progress can happen. So I really think that this is an extremely important dynamic. We come with notions, with treaty, with application, and as Ahmed said, a bit divorced from the ground, a bit divorced from the reality, and very often divorced from context. Even if we try in every aspect of our work to do briefing note before country dialogue, to contextualize the dialogue, it has nothing to do with the kind of contextualization we're talking about. We miss a lot of elements. So I really value a lot what I heard. I want to try to continue the dialogue with Diki Sofyan on the issue of minority in Indonesia, because I'm interested. I come from a country also that have an issue with the terminology minority, because it's a sum of minorities. So I would like maybe in one way or the other to learn more from him. That it would be also my other takeaway. Now, coming back to the question, and the very crucial one that Nora said, what would be the guidelines for selecting partners? And the comment from Hind on that, should we put a conditionality? Already there is conditionality. EU aid and many other assistance to NGO links to several agendas, and sometimes not the most neutral and positive agenda. Let's face it, there is a conditionality always. But if I was to be asked personally in an ideal world, I'll say all those are the worthy partner are the one that commits to the 18 commitments, period. If they agree with the 18 commitments, even if they are not yet there in implementation, but they want to be there, they're worthy. We need to accompany them. So because the 18 commitments really build this fraternity that we are looking for in partnership to change things on the ground. Coming to certain issues that were raised also by, I think, Sofyan, but also by Ahmed and also by Nora, about radicalism, extremism. And Sofyan said very nicely, we are doing half-time job in comparison with the other. Look at all the setback around us. They come from those extremists, and they are not necessarily a religious movement. They are simply populist, radical, that demonize the other. And there was also a comment in the chat about the demonization of one particular religion because of the association of word terrorism with, and that. I think this is really where we need to do most of the work. Because if I said to you earlier, I mentioned the Women Christian Association, I mentioned the illustration also of Musawa, it is simply to say, it's not only this one religion that is guilty of not abiding by gender equality. If we look now just quickly at the scene in Europe, we see Poland, we see Hungary, they have nothing to do with Islam. And we see setbacks on women's rights, on sexual and reproductive health and rights that are scary. And in fact, they canceled even the university unit on gender in Hungary. So what we need to look at that in a much more comprehensive way. I would say this is also part of being more literate in faith-related issue. I'm not saying literacy in the same sense that was alluded to. But for me, literacy, again, religious literacy is about respect, acceptance, acknowledgement of the other. This is the basic before even you become, I don't expect you to become a scholar, but I expect you to understand that you are not the only one in the truth, that everyone has his truth, his spirituality, her spirituality, and that you have to respect that. This is probably the beginning, first steps before we get into this big box of Pandora. But I'm very happy to get into it and try to learn more. So I really want to once more insist on the importance of the intersection between the bottom-up and the top-down approach. I think the work that Sofian spoke about with the G20 is also a lot a result of intersection between bottom-up and top-down interaction, and that's why it is yielding substantive results and hopefully change. And I'm very glad to note from Michael, how much I was not objective about really naming the declaration Beirut one, but every time I hear it was quoted, I feel we're doing for Lebanon much more than Lebanon government is doing for itself, so by keeping it on the map. So that was just a personal comment at the end. I can't help it, Brahim, I can't just divorce from my subjective feeling in difficult times. So I think I will stop here, and I hope I have answered also partly Mr. Ali, who was talking about the demonization of certain religion and what we are facing now. I mean, even in recent conflict between Israeli and Palestinian, we go back to the heart of the issues. We go back to the heart of the issue, the mosque, the perception, etc., and we just can't continue to turn our back on these issues. So thank you very much, and thanks again to the organizers and to OHCHR.
Thank you, Nahla. I cannot resist saying that your subjective comment is an objective demonstration of the power of civil society, of the power of independent experts of the United Nations system. I know that you know how much it suffers, and you're into the suffering, and Ahmed as well, because of the current crisis. But I feel and I see that independent human rights voices in the United Nations are kind of reinventing themselves, reinventing their tools and working methods. So we hope that the current crisis is rather an introduction to better changes and better rule. I have Shukriya Ali again. Can you take the floor this time? I saw your a yellow hand pumping at me, but again, I don't see you coming in with this. Just a quick comment, Nala, when I'm rereading Commitment 2 of the Beirut Declaration, it is exactly implicitly saying that this declaration is to be used as a common minimum standard of interaction between theistic, non-theistic, atheistic, and other believers. So the notion of pre-acceptance as a basis for action without any conditionality is built in. So I'm glad that we had this thinking in the making, even without giving it the same dedicated attention that interventions today have demonstrated.
Perhaps there's a technical problem for Shukriya Ali. So may I just read also the comment that was just posted? Quote, religious hatred should not happen in this modern world where everyone have their place and right to be loved and respected, unquote. And just to link this also very much to the existing modules on incitement to hatred and violence, that's module 7 in the Faithful Rights Toolkit. And this is going really to the heart of the peer-to-peer learning and also of understanding the not easy question how to define hate speech or incitement to violence in the first place. So there, I think really what is required is the engagement with the various faith actors and learn from each other and discuss and perhaps also disagree on specific definitions or on thresholds. But I think here the advantage of the toolkit is precisely to engage and to find the fine line between free speech and hate speech.
Thank you, Michael, for this. And I also want to read a comment from Esther Bombo commenting on the question of the red lines, how to distinguish the red lines, by saying who determines the red lines, especially on gender equality. And here probably, if I read the experience so far of our piloting of the peer-to-peer learning methodology, maybe the answer is that there is no specific preconceived, theoretically definable red line. It's through the dynamic of exchange So if human rights are a permanent work in progress, also the religious interpretations that Ahmed Said just said cannot be taken away from the context geographically and the context in terms of times and developments and challenges. So maybe the red line is a moving line. It's not a fixed one. I don't know. Now, maybe now, if Olivia and colleagues are ready, first, Olivia, if you have any remarks or questions or comments on these questions from your side, and secondly, if not, if we can show, how was it called, Michael? It's a trajectory in artistic trajectory of the 18 commitments. Yes. In a way, because I think this will give us a very useful pause to feel, not only to read these common standards, minimum common standards on the relationship between religion and human rights. Olivia, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. So we're in the last 5 minutes of the webinar now, so we'll be wrapping up soon. I think that my comments are only to reiterate a lot of what's been said, that it's exciting that we're having this conversation about religious literacy, but this is very much only the beginning. You know, religious literacy as a concept in academic debates has been growing for several years. There's a lot of learning coming out of all types of, you know, religious education, everything that's been known about that for many years, and now transferring it to professions such as work within international relations, international development is only the beginning of this journey, hopefully. And I was excited to see someone drop in the chat a training available about gender equality and FORB, for example. I know that on that same site where that training came up, there'll be other further trainings coming up on topics related to religious literacy, and I think we can only hope that those grow and deepen and become part of regular training practices amongst other efforts that we might have around religious literacy in our professions in this field. So what we'll do now to round up, thank you everyone for joining today. This is part of a series, so the first thing I'd like to say is that on the 17th of June, there'll also be a webinar on Matter of Faith, Comprehensive Sexual Education as GBV Prevention Strategy in Faith Settings, which will be very interesting and again get into some of these difficult and tricky questions that we need to talk about, in fact. And I'll put the link in the chat for and then finally, we will be just going over now to this video. So I thank everyone for their time and we'll watch the video to close out this session. Morma, if you can play the video now, that would be great. Thank you. Thank you to the speakers as well. Sorry, I forgot to mention, but thank you very much to the speakers and everyone for participating.
We commit to ensure non-discrimination and gender equality, particularly regarding harmful stereotypes and practices or gender-based violence. We pledge to ensure non-discrimination and gender equality in implementing this declaration on faith for rights. We specifically commit to revisit each within our respective areas of competence those religious understandings and interpretations that appear to perpetuate gender inequality, harmful stereotypes, or even condone gender-based violence. חסד ואמת נפגשו, צדק ושלום נשקו. חסד ואמת נפגשו, צדק ושלום נשקו. We pledge to ensure justice and equal worth of everyone, as well as to affirm the right of all women, girls, and boys not to be subjected to any form of discrimination and violence. This is our pledge. This is our commitment.
Pour être efficace, toute approche globale de renforcement des capacités devrait cibler les dirigeants influents. Notamment les chefs traditionnels et religieux.
צדק ושלום נשקו.
ਗੁਰੂ ਗ੍ਰੰਥ ਸਾਹਿਬ ਜੀ ਪੰਡ ਜੰਮੀਏ ਭੰਡ ਨਿਮੀਏ ਭੰਡ ਮੰਗਣ ਵਿਆਹੋ ਭੰਡੋ ਹੋਵੇ ਦੋਸਤੀ ਭੰਡੋ ਚੱਲੇ ਰਾਹੋ ਪੰਡ ਮੁਆ ਪੰਡ ਪਾਲੀਏ ਪੰਡ ਹੋਵੇ ਬੰਧਾਨ ਸੋ ਕਿਉ ਮੰਦਾ ਆਖੀਏ ਜਿਤ ਜੰਮੇ ਰਾਜਾਨ ਪੰਡੋ ਹੀ ਪੰਡ ਉਪਜੇ ਪੰਡੇ ਬਾਜ ਨ ਕੋਏ ਨਾਨਕ ਪੰਡੇ ਬਾਹਰਾ ਇੱਕੋ ਸਾਚਾ ਸੋਏ.
The world of humanity is possessed of two wings, the male and the female. So long as these two wings are not equivalent in strength, the bird will not fly. Until womankind reaches the same degree as man, until she enjoys the same arena of activity, extraordinary attainment for humanity will not be realized. Abdul Baha.
חסד ואמת נפגשו, צדק ושלום נשקו. מדד, 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 יא This is our pledge. This is our commitment.
Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you for that video and thank you for your time today. We'll end the session now. Have a good rest of your day.